Benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 164 of the secundae of the Summa Theologica. The topic for this lecture is the punishment of the first man's sin, which I might just be labeling as death, but it's death and more, but a nice Catholic approach to it. So again, we're looking at the cardinal virtue of temperance. We are looking at the potential parts of temperance, those virtues which strengthen and hold up temperance, give it its power. Of that, we're looking at modesty. We're under the potential part of modesty. The key virtue under modesty is humility. Its contrast to humility is pride, which then opens the door now to Adam and Eve and the first fall, which is what we are covering now. So we already looked at pride, man's first sin, and now we're looking at the punishments. This one, as I mentioned last time, only has 2 articles. So it could be very fast. I could just, is death natural very quickly, and are the other punishments just? We could do this in 2 minutes, but I think, and I don't always go into all the detail of all of the objections, but I think at this time they're worth it. I think the questions themselves are very interesting. St. Thomas gives a very Iron Man, Steel Man argument to the contrary. When you read it, you probably will agree with more of the objections that maybe even than St. Thomas. He makes them so strong. We have a tradition of making straw man arguments out of our, enemies, our opponents. We make arguments that they're not even making so that we can easily knock them down. St. Thomas gives very strong arguments for those who he's trying to argue against. So let's look at them. I think the more you look at them, the more there's some good wisdom in what St. Thomas has to say. So first, I think there were 8 questions in Article 1. So we'll go through 8 of these questions about death, which is perhaps one of the most interesting elements, things to talk about, and something that the Church has something unique and interesting to say on it, St. Thomas points out. So the first question is, the question overall is death a punishment for man's fall, for the fall of man? Or is death just natural, right? If death is just natural, then what do you need Adam and Eve for, right? We were going to die anyway, even without Adam and Eve. So St. Thomas in the first question says, and these I've summarized, a mortal is included in the definition. To be mortal is in the definition of sin. It's also in the definition of being a human being, right? To be a human being is to be a mortal. Then if being a human being is to be mortal, then to be mortal is naturally to die, right? It's just built into human nature that we will die, not because of Adam and Eve, not because of original sin, but because we are mortal. That's as simple as that. St. Thomas says, man is made up of form and matter. Now, the form is the soul, right? And the formal end, right? The formal matter. And human being's soul is immortal, right? So on one hand, we have an immortal soul. On the second hand, we have the body, which is the matter. The body is necessary. God created it that way so that we can touch and engage in the material world. Right? We are not meant to be angels, bodiless beings. We are embodied beings. And the example St. Thomas gives is of a craftsman who makes a sword. If you want to make a sword, also think of the 13th century. If you want to make a sword and you want to make it strong, something that can cut, something that can chop, do something of value, it's going to have to be of iron, right? Something strong. But a consequence of it being iron is that it's going to rust. So the rust is a consequence. But you see, a good craftsman can make a sword out of a even better material if they could, right? If you could, you would make one that would be just as hard as iron, but not rust, if that were possible. Now, since our craftsman is God, not a metal worker, God could create man out of a material that would be one that would be strong like iron but not rust. Now, that was the original. That was the original plan. That was the plan for Adam and Eve, was to be of that superior material. But with the fall, God withdrew that supernatural, using my own words, supernatural grace that would remove any fallenness to the matter, any brokenness to the matter. So it's saying, well, now you're on your own. I was going to give you steel, but instead you're getting you're just getting iron. And now you have the part of that nature of the iron is rust, or death. Right? That's now part of the matter. And there's a penitential sense. There's a loss of that divine favor that would have prevented man from death. But that was the original plan. The original plan was an immortal soul and an immortal body through divine favor. The divine favor removed, now you're just left with matter which dies. Okay, the next question is, well, since animals die and man is an animal, then shouldn't just people naturally die like animals, right? Very reasonable, very connected to the second argument. And St. Thomas says, well, man is composed of contraries, right? The immortal soul and the mortal body after the fall. But animals are not. Animals have a mortal body and a mortal soul. Therefore, animals don't have an immortal soul. They do have a soul, right? Some people say, does a dog have a soul? Well, of course it does. It has an animated dog soul. But it is a mortal soul, not an immortal soul. So animals naturally die without... they didn't have a fall from grace. There's no punishment in their death. It's natural to them as fully mortal beings. As humans being of contraries and not following its original plan, which would have been having that divine favor of not dying, it's contrary to human nature to die. Now this... the argument that the sin of our first parents is particular, right? So why should that affect me? So if Adam and Eve sin, good for them. It has nothing to do with me, right? So it can't be punishment because it has to do with them, not me. The response of St. Thomas is Adam and Eve are the principles of the whole human nature, not just of human bodies, but of human nature. They transmitted their condition, their nature to their posterity, and also as a penal consequence of the fall, God withdrew his favor from human nature. So without that the craftsman's extra good metal that doesn't rust, you're stuck with iron, which will rust. So it's a condition now. So you could say that's not fair. Well, God determines what's fair, and that's the plan. So read the book of Job if you don't like that. Maybe you'll get some insights. The next one is, well, if all of us are not, particularly guilty of the sin of Adam and Eve, but as a condition of the human nature, then we have all received death equally from Adam and Eve, but it seems like death affects people differently. Some people die sooner, some people die more painfully, right? It doesn't seem like, if you say, well, we're all inherit Adam and Eve's sin, well, it doesn't seem to affect people equally. Well, St. Thomas says, well, in two ways. First, in itself, death. Yes, all die. So in that way, it is perfectly equal, whether it's sooner or later, or more painfully or less painfully, or how it occurs. Everyone dies, therefore it is equal in terms of its accidental qualities, right? Its conditions, its situations. He says, divine providence has disposed of these penalties to be proportioned differently. So it's true, they're not equal. They're not intended to be equal, but divine providence chooses the time and the way and the penalties of Adam and Eve's sin in particular ways for each person. Some people, because they are weak, might have it easier because they wouldn't be able to overcome pain or or hardships. Other people, because they are very strong, might have more to test out their virtue or to create a stronger soul, right? Each person is given what has been divinely instructed, right? And you're not going to really understand that, right? You're not going to know why you received what you received, but it's not equal, not supposed to be, and it's, you can say it's not fair, right? But from the perspective of God, it all makes sense. It's all it's proportioned correctly, and it's not because, and St. Thomas points this out, it's not because a person has merited one or the other, right? It's not necessarily about being merited. If you jump off of a building and you die, well, then you did merit death in that way. But there's a lot of death and suffering that has nothing to do with what anyone has merited. It's just divine providence that has selected it. Now, another question. We're up to 5 already. God didn't make death, right? God is not the author of death. So the line from the Book of Wisdom, God made not death. So if God made not death, how can death be a punishment? And St. Thomas says, well, in 2 ways. We have to look at it in 2 ways. One, the natural consequence of the fall of human nature is not God's fault. God didn't cause us to fall. We fell. The iron will rust. That's our problem. It's not God's problem. God doesn't cause the rust. Our fallen nature, his withdrawal from his withdrawal of his favor for us has caused the rust, has caused the death. And that way, he didn't do anything. We did it. In terms of punishment, he says yes. So in terms of death as a just punishment for our sin, God does do that because it's what is just. It's what's right. So God does what is just and right. And in that way, as far as death as a punishment proper to us, yes, God does that because it is good, right? A bit of a contradiction for us now. So a punishment that is good. Well, God chastises those who he loves, right? He there is a goodness that ends up coming out of it, right? This becomes part of that paradox of death, right? Unless you die, you can't get to heaven, right? There is both a chastisement and the reward, right? At the end of the cross is the resurrection. Can't have the resurrection without the cross. So as much as it's a chastisement, it's a chastisement for a purpose, right? Again, back to divine providence. Is death sometimes meritorious? If it's meritorious, then how can it be a punishment? Now, the example given in the objection is, well, a martyr's death is meritorious, therefore it cannot be a punishment. Well, St. Thomas points out that wicked people abuse bad things and wicked people abuse good things. Wicked people are just wicked people. They don't produce anything good no matter what you give them. Holy people make use of good things and evil things. So holy people can use death in a meritorious way. So to the holy, all things are for the glory of God, right? If we look at Christ as an example of this, was Christ punished? Well, not for his own sake, right? But he can use his death. His death can be used for salvation, right? And he can use even the punishment of death for good. We're approaching the end now. Is death isn't painful, therefore it's not a punishment, which is it's kind of a strange argument. But since the argument is, since there's no, when you're dead, you're not in pain, so death isn't pain. And if you're when you're dying, you're not dead, therefore you're not in pain. Therefore, death isn't a punishment. St. Thomas points out is death is not painful. Being dead is not painful, but dying can be painful. I'm not sure why it has to be painful for it to be a punishment, but if you need it to be painful for it to be punishment, well, dying can be painful. If death is a punishment for sin, the sin of Adam and Eve, why didn't they just die? Right? if somebody is a murderer and they get sentenced to death, you just put them to death, right? You don't wait 300 years and then put them to death. And to which St. Thomas says it came eventually, right? When the time was right, it came. It was ultimately the end punishment for their pride was death. And St. Thomas's answer now, I'm going to read two little sections of it just because he's quite good and I might not always frame it the right way. For life and soundness of body depends on the body being subject to the soul, right? The immortal soul. You have an immortal soul. So the body should be subjected to the soul. Consequently, death, sickness, and all defects of the body are due to the lack of the body's subjection to the soul, right? We have a rational soul. We should act rationally, which would be according to God's law, which would be according to divine law. When our body does not follow our immortal soul and the divine law, it's in rebellion against us, which causes chaos within our bodies, and it causes chaos, which leads to death. The rebellion of our cardinal appetites against the Spirit is a punishment of our first parents' sin, as are death and all the defects of the body. I think that's a good point. So, and this was brought up last time too, last question 163, that before the fall of man, there were no carnal appetites. The carnal appetites of, the passions of sex, food, and drink. We didn't have passions. If you were hungry, you ate. That was it. There were no passions. It was after the fall that we now have these passions, which is why we now need temperance. Before the fall, there wouldn't have been no need for the virtue of temperance because everything was in its proper ordering, right? A bit like how an animal lives, right? Everything is properly ordered. It's only with our disordered desires now that we need things like temperance. And as a consequence, we need now temperance, but we also have death and other defects of the body because this all deals with matters of the touch. Pride affects the matters of the touch. Now, when we get to the second article, we could go through another 9 questions, but I think St. Thomas actually does a very good job this time summarizing all 9 of those objections into his answer. Last time he kind of didn't. He addressed the matter, but he answered the the objections in his response to the objections, which is why I did the objections and responses last time. But these, I think, he sums it all up very well in his I answer that section. So in terms of other punishments other than death for man as a response to Adam and Eve's fall, what happens to women? Well, these aren't all that. We know some of these. Anybody pretty well aware of these. Women receive weariness in pregnancy. After conception, they have weakness, weariness. So pregnancy is hard, right? Difficult childbearing. Second part, childbearing, pains of childbearing. That's another part. And third, subjected to her husband's authority. And that one might be the most controversial of the three. So Eve should be subjected to Adam. Now, it's probably not so hard to think that Eve should be subjected to Adam, since she's the one that caused him to eat the fruit. But as a consequence that all women are now subjected to their husbands, that becomes more controversial than probably anything else within this question. But as much as it might not seem fair, the second half of this is the challenges for the man, which is the earth will be very difficult to cultivate. Before, you just walked up to a tree and you ate. Now you have to work for it. Excuse me. You have to work by the fruit of your hands. The second part is that that it is work, that you only eat what you gather or you grow. You don't get any, there's no handouts. You only get what you produce. Therefore, you might get hungry. You might suffer because you're responsible now. And the third one, there are obstacles for the tiller. There'll be weeds and there'll be thistles and there'll be things that make it difficult. Floods and famines, and it will be difficult. These three they're all very closely tied together. But women's are mostly about childbearing and obedience, and men is about nature itself being your enemy and the responsibility of providing for you and your family. These, I think, are fairly well known, though. The last set of three are for both men and women, and these are probably not as much talked about because it's not as clear from Scripture. But men and women are put in a state of confusion and uncomfortableness. That section of they perceive themselves to be naked. There's now anxiety. There's now confusion. There's not a clear sense of purpose. There's shame. Shame has entered. They have reproach for their sins. They say now Adam is like us. That's what God, the Trinity, says. Now Adam is like us, and that they now have that knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the knowledge of good and evil is a burden, right? It might not be a burden to God because it's made for God's nature, but for man, it's now a bit of a burden. We're not just free anymore. We have the knowledge of good and evil. We have a moral sense about us. And lastly, we have the reminder of our death and mortality. God makes for them a loincloth made of skin to remind them of to hide their shame, but it reminds them of their own mortality, and that we will die. So these are the added burdens. These are the existential crises of the human condition, right? Of which we still end up dealing with quite a bit, right? Shame, knowledge, and our own mortality. These are big human issues that we deal with. I also wanted to just point out, since we're not covering all of the objections, there are two that stood out that I thought were interesting. one of the questions was, well, if they could have stayed in the garden, remember the angel drives Adam and Eve out of the garden. If they could have stayed in the garden, would they have lost their life? And St. Thomas says, if they could have stayed in the garden, they would have had access to the tree of life. And their life would have been prolonged, but it wouldn't have been immortal anymore. They lost it at the fall. He doesn't make this connection, but I think it's very clear, the connection of if they could have stayed in the garden, what would they have access to? The tree of life. Well, who is the tree of life? It's Jesus. Jesus is the tree of life. You eat from the tree of life, the Eucharist, and you have eternal life in heaven, right? So in some ways, Jesus was a return to the new garden, right? We have the new garden, but it's Gethsemane this time. And for each fallen Christian, we live in the garden, eating from the tree to live forever, right? So in some ways, St. Thomas doesn't point this out, but it's very clear. It's quite clear that prolonged life is now eternal life, right? It's not immortality, it's eternity, which there is a difference between eternal and immortal, right? Both of them are terms for God. God immortal, God eternal, right? These are similar but different. Lastly, and I love this from a long time ago, I heard this, but the Orthodox have it too. So I think it's a common thing amongst people at the time of St. Thomas. But what is the purpose of clothing now? And it's to protect us from the elements. Remember the curses of Adam, that the world is now against you, right? The world isn't feeding you, but you have to struggle against the world a bit. Well, this is issues of protection against the elements, and it also hides our ignominy, our shame. It hides our shame and the rebellion of our flesh, right? So why do we wear clothes? Well, protection from the elements and modesty, right? It's a reminder of our modesty, and it's a reminder of our fallen nature. We'll get into modesty more in terms of clothing and behavior in the next few questions after we get beyond pride. So in conclusion, death is a punishment and unnatural for human beings. That might be news to some people. And there are other suitable punishments, some for men, some for women, some for both. And it gets at the heart of our nature and our psychology too. I think that's an important part. So next we will move on to the temptations, and then we will be done with Adam and Eve for a while.